Brilliance Audio presents The Vixen by Christi Caldwell, performed by Tim Campbell. One of the luxuries of being the most successful investigator in England lay not only in the wealth one possessed, but also in one's ability to accept or decline whichever case one chose. There could not be any doubt. Connor Steele had built a vast fortune through his work. As such, he'd considered not coming. When the note had arrived on his desk, he had contemplated tossing the missive into a dustbin. In the end, he'd granted the upcoming audience not because of monies needed, but because one was wise to gather information. From each appointment, he could decide what to do with the case. But he'd not flourished as the head investigator by turning down assignments from the wealthiest, most powerful peers in London. Despite the presence of two uniformed servants, a heavy silence loomed in the soaring foyer. While the surprisingly fresh-faced butler examined the card he'd handed over, Connor touched his gaze on the grand space, from the white Italian marble floor to the sweeping red velvet carpeted staircase and the crystal chandelier that hung overhead. The gentleman who sought to utilize his services was deep in the pockets. "If you follow me," the tall, ginger-haired servant murmured the only words exchanged since he'd opened the door and Connor had offered over his card. After handing Connor's cloak to the footman, the butler started down the corridor that intersected the foyer. Connor glanced over to the liveried servant who, garment in hands, melted into the shadows. Keeping a slower pace behind the butler, Connor followed after him. The most skilled of investigators, he missed nothing and saw all. It was a lesson not known by most, and one Connor had come by not in the 10 years since he'd established his own business, but rather from the years he'd spent living on the streets. To miss a detail could see a man with his throat sliced. It was a rule of life Connor was not so naive to believe was reserved only for the streets of East London, but for all of England, from its dark alleys to its glittering ballrooms. The butler looked over his shoulder, and then adjusted his pace as he led them down a bisecting hall. "This way, Mr. Steele," he muttered, and then another blanket of silence descended as Connor was ushered along. While they made the long journey through the Marquis of Maddox's Mayfair townhouse, Connor catalogued every detail, ultimately settling on the single most defining element of the palatial residence: silence. It was the single word that defined this household and the staff contained within. A manner of quiet that felt sharp at a person's ear and discouraged discourse, all the while punctuating what otherwise would have been mundane sounds: the distant tick of a clock, the tread of a quiet footfall, the groan of a floorboard. The young butler slowed his steps, bringing them to a stop. He paused, waiting until Connor reached the heavy oak panel before rapping. That pressing silence remained. Then a harsh voice sounded from within the room. "Enter!" The efficient servant was already twisting the door handle, allowing Connor entry. Doing a sweep of the room as he stepped inside, Connor at last settled his stare on the figure seated at the desk. Head bent over whatever task occupied him, the man didn't even deign to look up. The butler cast an apologetic glance in Connor's direction, and then cleared his throat. "My lord, Mr. "I know bloody well who it is," the man seethed. From where he sat at his desk, a ledger open before him, and by both his command of the room and the fear he evoked, there could be no doubting the man's identity. "Get the hell out, Quint." The butler may as well have been politely dismissed for the grace with which he exited. "And close the door after you've gone," the gentleman whispered, still not bothering to lift his head. The young servant inclined his head. Once the man had gone and the room was quiet, Connor strode forward, uninvited. With every step that carried him closer, he intensified his study of that figure who'd long been whispered about amongst polite society: the Mad Marquis,